as expected. Anyway, all eyes today are on Boris Johnson. Did you see any of that kind of privilege committee grilling? It was supposed to be up to about 5 hours. I think it ended up taking about 3 there or thereabouts in the end, so I bet he was relieved to get off early. He seemed to play it quite down the line, seemed to take it quite seriously. There was no main drama to report, and it all refers, doesn't it, to whether or not he knowingly misled Parliament throughout the Partygate era. Let's cut to the chase, Jo. I'll start with you. What did you make to it all?
Well, he was better behaved than I expected him to be. He was quite combative, and he started off, I think, by trying to make some jibes about the fact that Harriet Harman, who chaired the committee, had said previously, before she was appointed to chair the committee, that she thought he'd lied to Parliament, but he was relatively respectful. There were a couple of times when you could see he was getting rattled, and he clearly isn't comfortable without his audience of acolytes and the sort of the cheering and booing and, oh, he's just Boris. He sounded like a half-wit, to be perfectly honest. The idea that the Prime Minister of this country would walk, into a room or into a garden of Downing Street and see a group of people with bottles and trestle tables and not think, there seems to be a party going on, having spent every evening on the television telling the rest of us how to behave, it just beggars belief. He seemed to want to blame his advisers. He's the Prime Minister, or was the Prime Minister. You have to decide. That's the old adage. Advisers advise, ministers decide. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out there were parties going on, and surely you would have... I can't imagine, I was just saying to Ben before we came in the studio, I can't imagine Theresa May, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, or anybody else not saying, what on earth is going on?
Well, Keir Starmer didn't seem to have said what on earth is going on when he was having his little meeting, shindig, curry, beer. So it's not as click up. But anyway, in my mind, what I just heard you say then is essentially you think Boris is guilty as charged.
Well, I think, the public will have made their minds up. I think what is more significant, and I know we're moving on to Northern Ireland in a minute, and Dennis McShane just said it on Patrick's programme, that actually Boris Johnson and Liz Truss went through the lobby against the government, but there were only 27 other people with them. And I think, we're not going to know the results of this Privileges Committee until after the local elections in early May. So there'll be a lot of picking over analysis of body language and all of that sort of stuff in the papers tomorrow and shows like this. But I think most people have made up their minds. It's what the committee recommend should happen to him.
Yeah, I can assure you I will not be sitting there nitpicking over body language and all the rest of it. I can't think of anything more dull, quite frankly. Ben Habib, your thoughts on the going...
Well, I mean, just go back to basics. Why is him having a party important? And the reason it's important for me is that it was a law that he put in place that stripped the nation of its civil liberties, brought the economy to its knees, and damaged the health and welfare of millions of people across the country. Loved ones had to die, and so on their own. And so this was, at one level, you can kind of roll your eyes and say, well, it's Boris having a party, big deal. But actually, fundamentally, there was something very wrong with having a party when the nation was going through what it went through, and the long-term consequences which we're now experiencing from lockdown. So I do take the matter seriously. And it turns not on whether he misled Parliament. He accepts he misled Parliament. It's whether he intentionally did so. Whether he knowingly did so. And I'm afraid I find him wanting there because he's hiding behind his advisers saying, well, I was told that it wasn't a party, all the rules were followed. Well, you're the Prime Minister.
Exactly.
And, if there's a cake there and there's lots of booze and people are laughing and joking, it's kind of a party. And I don't really buy the excuse that he had to morally boost his staff at this very difficult time. They were working 24/7. We were all going through a very difficult time. And the vast majority of us didn't break the rules in order to get feeling better. I think a number of us did. And I may have broken the rules, frankly, for all I know. The rules were complex and daft. But, Do we need to move on as a nation? I think we need to move on from Partygate. Has he lost his political capital? As Joe mentioned, I think he has. I don't think there's any coming back for Boris Johnson from today, and largely because he didn't carry more people through the no lobby on that vote. He was isolated. And I find it peculiar, we're going to get to the Windsor Framework, but I find it peculiar that Boris Johnson, who constructed the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is essentially the same as the Windsor Framework, should vote no. Having put the Northern Ireland Protocol in place, having had an 80-seat majority with which he could have unwound it, he didn't do it. He walked through the no lobby and very few people followed him. And that says to me that Boris Johnson as a political force is over. Does he care? Probably not. He's made over 5 million quid in the last 5 months.
Yeah.
Boris has landed on his feet.
And he looks like, I have to say, looks like a much more rested
He
man.
does.
When you see him today, he looks way less.
So would you and I if we were
dishevelled.
making 5 million quid churning out speeches and things
This
and
is
not
very
turning
true.
up to Parliament very often?
He hasn't even made the speeches. He's been paid up front for some of them. You know, exceptional earnings.
One other thing is, I can't help but just land this point, and I know it'll make some of my viewers groan, but when I watch all these goings on, I found them ridiculous today and I found them ridiculous at the time. I sit and I can't help but think, none of you lot in these offices, gardens, whatever, you were not frightened of COVID. So
No.
while we were being told at 5
Absolutely.
o'clock on the night, or whatever it was, these next slide, please, ridiculousness, we were being made to feel that we literally were going to kill each other, we were probably going to die ourselves, this was the worst thing to happen to this country in God knows how long, and therefore everyone had to stay in and all the rest of it. You lot, with the details closer to you than anyone else, you were not afraid. You were getting together, and I don't care really if you want to call it a party or a work do or a go. I don't really care, quite honestly, about this. I think it's a bit of
You're
a
right.
distraction.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
But Ben's point about, Boris Johnson saying, it was my duty, to boost morale. Well, who needed morale boosting more than old people in care homes?
Well,
who
all
were not
68 million British citizens
Yes.
who were locked up.
And people working in the health service. It's just appalling. He's got no self-awareness and no understanding of all the things that we all agree on. That, yes, you're frightening the wits out of everybody else. You're imposing rules that you don't even understand, and you don't recognise a social gathering in a building because it's an old building with higgledy-piggledy rooms.
Well, what do you think the outcome of all of this is going to be then?
Well, I think it'll melt away into nothingness. I mean, there's a possibility that the committee will sanction him and suspend him for more than 10 days, in which case there could be a recall in Uxbridge, and he's sitting on a wafer-thin majority. I might stand against him if he decides to stand again.
Oh, you heard it here first.
Oh, breaking news.
Well, it'll be fun.
I want to
It'll be fun,
talk to you
wouldn't it?
about this whole reform thing as well before the end of the programme, because that really caught my interest. But do you reckon 10%, because 10% has to turn out basically to trigger that, do you reckon that amount of people would?
Well, I think he's honour bound to resign at that point as an MP. I think it's very hard.
Oh, I love. Do you think that he would?
Sorry, when you say honour,
Yeah, do you think he would?
I think it's unlikely, Ben.
So you think... So what do you reckon the outcome's going to be then? Do you reckon we're going to have this 10-day plus suspension and the situation we've just been discussing, or do you think it'll be...
I think we are. I think there's a high probability of a 10-day plus suspension.
I think he'll try and fight it.
I think he will.
I think if they say it was reckless, it might not, which is not as bad as deliberate, intentional. But if they say it was reckless, which I think
But he would then fight. He would then face a by-election if he fights it.
yeah.
He'd have to stand again.
Yes, I know, but I think he would fight the findings of the committee.
But he can't. I mean, they are the ultimate authority.
And then around and around we go. Dawn, one of my viewers says, this is a useless waste of time at taxpayers' expense.
Well, yes,
a
we
whole
are paying for
afternoon taken by an entire committee for personal nonsense reasons. You basically saying it's people with a vendetta. You're calling it utterly disgusting. Andy says all these people telling you to get over it and move on are part of the problems we have in the UK.
He's right. And he's right.
I agree. Tim says, I do not care about any of this. There's far more important things to worry about, such as Russia and China. Richard says, yes, I do care about all of this. It shows the absolute arrogance of the entire number 10 machine under Boris Johnson. Graham calls it a pathetic, vindictive shower, a kangaroo court. Boris Johnson said that he didn't like people calling it a kangaroo court. At least that's what he's saying in public anyway. Doreen said the whole thing was hilarious. Jackie Weaver should have been chairing it. Other countries will be laughing at this and us. This is not the last you've seen of Boris. Ian, yeah, you make the same point that I do in terms of how come so many people were not so afraid of COVID when we were being terrified. Ron says a waste of time. Most working people and non-workers, for that matter, haven't got time for this nonsense. It has no impact on our lives at all. And Deb says, yawn, 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 yawn. What a smoke screen, she says, to distract us all from other issues.